Okay, well, thanks so much, everybody, for being here today. We're so lucky to have Zoom. That's the only way we'd be able to have Pippa and Joe do a webinar. So thank you so much, Joe and Pippa, for doing that. Joe and Pippa are still in Wales, and they're joining us from Wales today. This is a BNP sponsored event. Let's see, at the end of June, Joe and Pippa were in Madrid, Spain for the NATO conference, and they were protesting NATO. So today they're going to talk to us about their trip and their thoughts on NATO, and hopefully a few thoughts about the Ukrainian war. And the format is going to be first Pippa's going to speak, then Joel's going to speak, and then we'll have question and answers. And the way we've got this set up at this point, I think everybody has the opportunity to speak. So maybe you want to self-mute while we're doing the presentations, and then unmute when we get to the question and answers. So I think that was all I had to say. Shall we go ahead with Pippa's presentation?
Another person has come in, Trudy.
Okay, that would be Jeff Halpern, and I think I let him in. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Shall I start then, Trudy?
I'd say go ahead, Pippa. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're working through a lot of weird time zones. In fact, it's a weird time generally, isn't it? So I guess this is the least weird of it all. But yes, Joe and I were in Madrid. Joe had been invited to speak at one of the counter summits running alongside the actual NATO summit. And we joined two summits, a peace summit, a counter summit, and also the rally the following day and the march. So here's a little bit of background. And if I seem to skip over some subjects, please do ask at the end in the Q&As for more depth. But, you know, it's such a vast subject, it's really hard to cover it all in a few minutes. So after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991, NATO lost its reason for being. It should logically have disbanded, but you know, NATO is an important tool of capitalism, and like capitalism, it must raid and expand. So it spread its poisonous skirts over 30 countries and has purposely become a direct threat to Russia, China, and obviously world peace. So capitalism, it thrives under constant antagonism. The more guns we have, the more secure we are told. It's a very bad joke. The more weapons, the more wars, the more propaganda employed to manufacture our consent, the more discord to divide society, and the more guns, the more wars, and so on. NATO cynically uses concepts such as democracy and human rights to extend Western geopolitical interests. And yet NATO itself does not hesitate to violate the UN Charter, for example, as it did in Libya. Now, whilst I was there was one particular speaker who I thought embraced all the subjects which concern us, that of refugees, migration, war, and climate change. Her name was Katerina Anastasiou. She's Greek, and she works with Transform Europe. So she talked of concepts of a human-centered and non-militarized security, in which the actual needs of people take priority, where security is based on peace. She talked extensively about environmental issues, the need to protect the land and the sea from pollution, and the respect of all living things. Her intense humanity impressed me. And the panel, because I'm not going to put words into her mouth, which was called "What Kind of Security Architecture for Europe?" is on my Facebook page at the moment, and I can circulate a link for anyone who wants to have another look. I can also put it on the BNP Facebook page as well. So the following day, there was a huge march through Madrid. That was the 26th of June. And I noticed a growing number of environmental groups, all the groups we know and many that we don't know. It was clear that the link between war and environmental degradation had been made and was, you know, becoming equally as concerning as the anti-war movement. The poisoning of the soil, the degradation of communities, infrastructures, the rights of Mother Nature, and the ideological inability of capitalism to embrace the healing of the planet were evident in banners and posters, some of which I put up on Facebook at the time. Environmental groups are closely allied to human rights groups, and thus the rights of the refugee, the punishing borders, the hardships caused by wars and climate change were of clear concerns. As was said in the summit, we make war on their countries, we force them to flee, and then we shoot them at the borders. So I'm just going to give you a little bit now about the 2022, what NATO calls its strategic concept, which was adopted at their summit, the 29th and 30th of June. So the alliances, point number one, the alliance's key purpose and greatest responsibility is to ensure the collective defense of allies. Note, allies, not members. Almost anyone can be an ally these days, can't they? NATO's core tasks are deterrence and defense. Now, provocation is not defense or deterrence, and that is what we have seen most recently on the Russia-Ukrainian border. Crisis prevention and management, this is what they say they're going to do. But in expanding eastwards, NATO have created a cascade of crises: grain supply, energy supply, fertilizer supply, millions of refugees, the death of thousands. Cooperative security is their point 4. This mostly means every country must increase its military budget, make more weapons, and recruit more cannon fodder. Because, as we know, all wars are class wars. Who gets killed? Yeah, well, I don't need to answer that. NATO enlargement has directly and indirectly destabilized most of the world, with food insecurity, energy insecurity, the threat of expanding the theatre of war. The NATO website goes on to say, the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. Well, it was. It was very much at peace. We might have been bombing other countries, but the Euro-Atlantic area was actually at peace. And it has the cheek to say it's not at peace. Clearly, this was all thought out well beforehand. It says the Euro-Atlantic security is undermined by strategic competition and pervasive instability. Their words. But on the other hand, we're told that competition is healthy, except maybe when it comes to ideology. Some ideologies get put forward with bombs. Some don't. Some build bridges. But then the Euro-Atlantic areas were stable until NATO, under the cloak of the US and the neoliberal ideology, provoked the invasion of Ukraine. And let's also look at the word ideology as well, because it's kind of morphed into a public concern about oil prices and cost of living, but really what we're talking about is a conflict of ideologies. This is the propaganda uses all sorts of tools to creep into our lives and force us to accept something which is not actually true. So the Russian Federation apparently, according to NATO, poses the most significant and direct threat to Allies' security. As I said before, for security, you probably should read perceived ideology. It also says, terrorism is an asymmetric threat to the security of our citizens and to international peace and prosperity. So oddly enough, the US does actually finance terrorism, as I'm sure most of you know. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Azov, the right sector, the national militia. The US is actually paying their wages. $40 billion have gone that way. They're paying the military, they're paying the civil servants. America is actually paying for Ukraine now. It's also financing Nazis. The website of NATO also goes on to say the People's Republic of China stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, security and values. Well, we're probably back to ideology again, but you know, you wouldn't call the Belt and Road Initiative coercive, would you? This is about bridges, not bombs. This is about cooperation, not violence. Another excerpt from their front page on NATO on their key strategic aspects is we face the global and interconnected threats and challenges like climate change. Well, climate change is probably the biggest threat of all, but it's, you know, at least it's in there. But in contrast, they have given themselves a mandate to police the old energy systems, because that's a lot of what they're about now, at the expense of renewable energy creation, at the expense of life, and eventually of liberty. The fossil fuel energy systems have to be kept going, because on that is still the flimsy and wavering power of the petrodollar. It talks about emerging and disruptive technologies. Well, clean energy is a disruptive technology, fair enough, but it would give us all a fighting chance to live. It talks about the erosion of the arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. Well, hang on, who has actually eroded those these architectures of nuclear non-proliferation and weapon disarmament? The US has done more than any to erode these architectures. NATO will continue to adapt and develop politically and militarily to meet the challenges of a more unpredictable and competitive world. Well, I'll end with this. The codependencies in this world are nothing to be afraid of, but the US and NATO fight them anyway. We should embrace and use our codependencies to improve our relationships with each other and with nature. And the bottom line is, if we don't do this, we probably won't have a future worth living in. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. I'll hand over to Joe now, who'll give you more detail about the actual anti-NATO summits and the peace conferences. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Pippa. Hello to everybody. It's really nice to see my friends from the Capital District again. We intend to be back probably in October, and then we'll be there for a year before we come back over here for a while again. So just to reemphasize some of the things that struck me from the NATO summit, a number of which Pippa said, but just to reemphasize the main points that I saw was, first of all, that NATO has decided to expand. And here's an organization that was supposed to stop the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union stopped years ago, but rather than folding up, they have expanded. They expanded into 14 countries bordering Russia that they said they would not expand into. But now during this conference, they said they want to expand further and not just become a North Atlantic organization, which it was supposed to be, although it has been moving rapidly away from that, but a worldwide organization. And as a result, they want to seek partners and other members outside of the North Atlantic area. They emphasized two enemies, basically. One was Russia, and the other was China. And as to make it clear about China, they have also included some partners, NATO partners, who I assume will eventually become NATO members if they continue along this vein, from Asia. That includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So they want these countries and have made these countries NATO partners. U.S. Has surrounded Russia and has surrounded China with military infrastructure, many, many bases. The United States has about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries combined. And the second and third most countries with foreign military bases are Britain and France, left over from their imperial days. And these are, of course, two NATO allies of the United States. So NATO in general has vast amounts of foreign military bases all over the world. The two summits that took place to oppose the NATO summit, one was called the Peace Summit and the other was called the Counter Summit. I was able to speak at the Counter Summit, and they represented some differences that exist in the anti-war movement over there and over here and around the world. The anti-war movement has become more and more divided lately in the past several years, starting with the NATO invasion and bombing of Libya, where Omar Gaddafi was overthrown. There were some people in the progressive movement, in the left, in the anti-war movement, who thought that was a good thing, that Gaddafi was a dictator and therefore the Western world, Europe and the United States or NATO, had a right to overthrow him. A similar thing happened with Syria. There was a division in the movement. Some of us thought that it was wrong for the US intervention. US and NATO helped bring in around 100,000 mercenaries, mostly jihadists, to fight that war to try to overthrow Assad. But there were parts of the anti-war movement that thought that was basically okay because Assad was a bad guy in their opinion. In my opinion, every country has the right to self-determination. If any country is going to overthrow its leader, it has to do it. It doesn't come from the United States or NATO. And the big division now is over Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine. And that's what I talked about at the Counter Summit where I spoke. The Counter Summit was made up of anti-war groups that considered themselves anti-imperialist. And the Peace Summit, the other summit, was made up of groups that might have found themselves on the other side of this divide. And they called themselves a Peace Summit, not a Counter Summit. And I think there was something in those names. We're all for peace, but they didn't want to necessarily be a strong counter to what NATO was doing. Both summits came out with strong statements against NATO, but it was only the Counter Summit that even mentioned what's going on in Ukraine. And what's going on in Ukraine right now, in my opinion, is what's going on center stage, the most prominent, the most important thing in world politics today. So for a gathering of anti-war activists to not seriously take up that issue and not talk about it at a NATO conference when NATO is very heavily involved in Ukraine, I think was a missed opportunity at least. In my talk, I told my position, which is also the position of the leadership of the United National Anti-War Coalition, which I am the coordinator of. And that is that this was a provoked war. It was a war of choice. It did not have to happen. It was provoked first by the West, Europe and the United States surrounding Russia in areas and in countries where they said they would not go into, but today NATO is in those countries that surround Russia. in those countries holding provocative military maneuvers or war games right on the border, in some instances in sight of the border of Russia. And Russia considered that a threat. In some of these countries we have placed, the United States has placed, in countries of its NATO allies, missiles that are capable of having nuclear weapons, carrying nuclear weapons, so nuclear capable missiles. And Russia sees this as a threat, just like the United States saw in the Cuban Missiles Crisis, the possibility of Russian missiles being near our border as being a threat. Well, Russia considered the same thing, but it saw Ukraine as a red line, as something that it did not want to see the West cross for a few reasons. One is Ukraine had a very long border with Russia, the longest border of any of the NATO or European countries. And at places on that border, if a nuclear missile was placed and fired, it would actually be within 4 minutes of hitting Moscow. And Russia said it could not live with that. That was, something hanging over their head that would not allow for their security and could not live with that. So they said NATO going into Ukraine was a bridge too far. It was a red line for them and they would not allow it to happen. But Ukraine had another threat to Russia. In 2014, there was a coup, which the US was very heavily involved in. In fact, I would say planned the coup and orchestrated the coup. And it started with people in Ukraine who were protesting a government that they had problems with, who were protesting a bad economy, who were protesting corruption in the government. But the government was headed by a party which was called the Party of Regions. It was the largest party in the country, and it had a policy of both trying to have good relationships with Europe and with Russia. And the United States did not want to see that, so they helped create a coup that overthrew that party. And the people that came into power and the people that were the shock forces of that coup were Nazis, sometimes the left calls people Nazis, but these are real Nazis. Pippa and I have been in the Ukraine and before the war, and we saw them march in the street. We saw the swastikas that they carried. Well, the hammer and sickle was banned after this coup in Ukraine. The swastika was not, and it was everywhere. It was on people's clothing. It was on the streets. It was chalked on walls. And these people, these Nazis, were part of the government, in high places in the government. And the US helped form them into militias that eventually became part of the actual military of Ukraine. So Russia was very concerned that people with Nazi leanings that hated Russians, the first act of this coup government was to ban the Russian language. Then they banned the Party of Regions. Then they banned the second largest party in Ukraine, which was the Ukrainian Communist Party. They didn't ban the Nazi party, so they were included into the government. So Russia was concerned also that if Ukraine became a NATO power and had nuclear weapons that could be 4 minutes away from Moscow, and they could be in the hands of Nazis who hated Russians and hated Russia, that this was too big of a danger for them. Something else happened after the coup, which is never talked about in the United States. The military in the Ukraine was not very strong at the time of the coup. An estimate is that they had about 6,000 hardened troops. They had many more troops than that, but 6,000 who were thought to be combat ready and were hardened. And the US built that military. They encouraged more people to go in. They trained them. They had military advisors. They armed them and grew it to be the 5th largest army in the world, a large army in the Ukraine. And they announced, the government of Ukraine, that they were going to take back the areas that after the coup, there were protests all throughout the country. And two areas actually broke away from Ukraine and formed independent republics, or People's Republic of Lugansk and People's Republic of Donetsk. So, and also another area, Crimea, voted over 90% to go back to Russia because it had been part of Russia up until the 1950s. And so areas protested the coup, and some areas left the government over what happened in the coup. In many areas where the protests took place, they were put down violently by Nazi forces, such as in Ukraine, in Odessa, where Pippa and I were, where there was a massacre. There was another massacre that took place in Mariupol. This now larger army was going to take back these regions. It announced it. And they started building up their forces to 100,000 or more. Some people say 150,000 right on the Donbas border. And they started shelling these regions even more than they had since the years of the coup, the 6 years since the coup. And then they crossed that line of demarcation. That's when Russia came in. They said to protect the Russian-speaking population, which is about a third of the country, and but also to ensure their own security. They could not have NATO in Ukraine right on their borders in these circumstances. That's how the war started. Now, whatever you think about the war, it was, in my opinion, provoked. I think the United States thought that through massive sanctions on Russia, it could hurt the Russian government, especially when it was in a war against a powerful army armed by the United States and trained by the United States, and that Russia would probably fall. But Russia had made agreements with many other countries, notably China, which has close to a fourth of the population of the world in China, and India, which is the second largest country in the world, and other countries. And it ensured that it would not fall with the harsh sanctions. And in fact, because it has it's the first grain producing country in the world, and it has lots of oil and natural gas and makes fertilizers, what really happened was the countries that were dependent upon gas and crops started seeing massive inflation, and at the same time what they call stagflation, which means inflation at the same time as a declining economy, which is something that doesn't really happen. Inflation often happens when economies are growing. Russia has not collapsed, but the West is in a real lot of trouble. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to get out of this war. And this is what I expressed in the talk I gave, which was very well received in Madrid. And we need to think about ways to get out of it, and sending more weapons and continuing with the sanctions and continuing with this war posturing against the nuclear force, and now even going further and starting saber rattling against China over Taiwan is even making this situation worse. So NATO is becoming an aggressive arm of the US military. And that's what we saw in Madrid, and that's what we opposed. In the demonstration, besides the two counter summits, in the demonstration, we saw a large demonstration in Madrid. We saw it covered by all the news media, on TV, in the newspapers. One newspaper had it as the full front page of their newspaper. Thousands of people marched through Madrid. They were very radical. They were, had a lot of socialist literature, hammers and sickles. There was other groups. There were groups, as Pippa mentioned, that are working on issues of climate change, Extinction Rebellion, others. And it was a militant demonstration that was anti-NATO. Later on, after this, we made another trip up towards Germany, where we met some other people that had similar positions on Ukraine, and other people that had similar positions on NATO. We were able to speak at their rally. The next day after the rally where we spoke, they had a rally in support of Cuba. We were able to provide a statement for in the name of the U.S. anti-war movement and UNAC in particular. So that was our experience in Madrid and in Germany. And I really think there are many, many people, although we don't hear about it in the news media, there are many, many people that are starting to question this war in Ukraine, and that are being hurt by the economic situations that it is causing and are ready to oppose it. We're seeing the government in Britain, where we are falling, as Boris Johnson is being forced out. The government of Italy is being forced out. And a lot of it has to do with the economic problems that people are finding. So anyway, that's more than I intended to say, but let me stop there and maybe we can go into questions and discussion. Maybe Trudy can start off and see what she wants to do at this point.
Okay, well, do we have any questions at this point? One comment I wanted to make is that I think here in the US, we're not hearing as much about the Ukraine war in the news. It's almost like they want to distract us with something else. And there are so many other issues here. There's drought, climate change, high inflation. So I think people are so distracted with all these other problems. And I think our government is trying to get us to forget all about it. It's not, it's way different in that way than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're living, I think, in really strange times. I don't know. A lot of times I don't think there's any coverage at all that you can really depend on. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the coverage in Europe is better? Do you think people there have an idea what's going on in Ukraine?
Why don't we see if there's any other questions and then take a couple of questions.
All right. Okay. Are there other questions?
I see Janet's hand is up.
Oh, you want to go ahead, Janet?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So let me just mention that the China-Taiwan issue is sort of heating up, although I believe Pelosi will not be visiting Taiwan. Evo Morales has called for NATO to be dismantled. A good thing, in my opinion. Scott Ritter has talked about how NATO is really weak and full of bluster. I wondered, Joe, maybe you could talk about the history of how Nazis were part of the beginnings of NATO. But a question I've been thinking about, another question is, assuming Russia continues succeeding in meeting the objectives of its SMO in Ukraine, which it seems like that's been the case, can any of you think of a settlement offer Russia could come up with that would allow the US, NATO, and Ukraine to save face? I mean, I think if there's going to be some kind of end to this, it would have to be Russia basically requiring certain things, but the US, NATO, and Ukraine would maybe have to be able to save face. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, how about John Flanders has also got a question. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to comment about the previous question. I don't see the Russians, I don't see anything except their defeat for Ukraine, particularly coming out of this. That's all. Unequivocal, unconditional defeat, it's going to collapse. Very likely to collapse. And I don't think anything else will probably solve the problem, because the Russians are not in a particular mood to negotiate now, and why should they? And I don't think the U.S. is going to agree to anything except a defeat, recognizing a defeat and putting it in the memory hole and hoping people don't forget about it. That's what I see anyway.
Okay, do you want to keep taking questions or do you want to answer those, Joe? And we've
Well,
got.
why don't we take the next two? There's two other hands up. Why don't
All
we
right,
take those
all
and then we'll
All
answer?
right, how, Jeffrey Halpern, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Joe, Pippa. Thanks for giving this testimony here, this report. I'm very interested in the two conferences, the two counter NATO events you went to. You said one seems to be, I'm not really that schooled in the history of the movement in Europe. One seems to be more of an anti-imperialist stand. One seems to be more of a pacifist stand. Do those groups seem to be, do you have a feeling that because those groups could work together to get this war to end? Or what would be the way to bring them together? Could a similar thing happen in this country? Because I know I'm a pacifist, so that's my question. How can we
Okay.
build the movement in Europe and here?
Okay.
Okay, and then there's one more from Jason. Go ahead, Jason.
Hi, all. Thank you for hosting this important webinar. So I was just wondering, I've been hearing a lot about that Spain is trying to add Monaco as protected territory under NATO. NATO, because it's a sponsorship occupation. So I was wondering whether, there was a large contingent of organizations from Morocco, even the Western Sahara, and just basically African organizations there, and if there could be anything a little more talked about potential strategies in the future outside of the Ukraine crisis.
Pippa, do you want to go first, or do you want to go second, or do you want me to go first, or what? You're on mute.
I'm happy to go first if you like. I probably won't answer them exactly the same way as Joe will, so we'll both have a go. All right. The first question from Janet, or several questions from Janet. Thank you very much for your questions. In terms of news cycle coverage, it has pretty much dropped off here. We get probably a little bit more of it here than you do there. But we listen to some of the US radio stations, and there's almost nothing on Ukraine. And there's very little from our own. But across Europe, it's slightly more different. I have family in Germany, as you know, and we did visit them. And they're much more frightened than we are in Britain or you are in the US, because it's on their land mass. It's not very far away, and they have deep concerns. But more than that, other things, shifts, political shifts. My daughter-in-law, for example, who's consistently voted Green for almost all her voting life, is so disappointed, as I am, with the German Greens in promoting war, in promoting this support of this US-NATO effort, and the German government support. For the first time, German government are arming up, are spending more, are actually even planning on probably having the second biggest army in the world. So this is very worrying, the fact the Greens have gone along with it. And whilst they may be using it as a tool to get more carbon-free architecture and infrastructure around the country, I think it's backfired horribly. So the Greens are falling out of favour, and Olaf Scholz, who is a quiet gentleman and doesn't get a lot of airtime, is staying out of the limelight, because it is a tricky situation for Germany. And I really feel that where we're going across Europe now, the Germans are being asked to ration their own fuel usage, to cut back on all these things. Their cost of living is going up as well. But who stopped the implementation or the live flowing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Germany did. Now, the propaganda cycle, which is not really a news cycle anymore, is it? It's a propaganda cycle where it exists, is saying, oh, Putin's stopping the gas, Putin's stopping the flow of oil and gas. But they've stopped it themselves. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was to run north of the Nord Stream 1, which has had some maintenance issues, and I think Putin's run out of patience with that. So news cycle coverage is deeply worrisome where it exists, and very, very biased in favor of the US and NATO. On the subjects of China and Taiwan, why? I mean, why poke that? Why create such discord in the world, which is just so unnecessary? But I agree, I think the chances of Pelosi going to Taiwan are quite remote, but you never know. But stirring up the Chinese in this way, there was a long conversation, I think, with Biden and Xi yesterday, I think it was, which was very uncompromising. And the Chinese are really saying, if you do this, you're going to pay a high price for it. So there we are, inflaming people. In terms of Morales' opinion, well, I think there are a lot of countries, and I forget the number, who are being sanctioned by the US currently, and they're all gradually joining up. And together, although they're not nuclear armed countries, most of them anyway, they are going to make NATO look weak. If they can just keep their act together and make common cause, it will be very interesting. The Russian objectives for a peace agreement, well, the last Ukrainian negotiator who did broker an agreement was shot dead. It doesn't look good for negotiators when things like that happen. But I would imagine that it would be, no NATO expansion, and that Russia would keep the Donbass. I would have thought, under the circumstances, would be a good way of saving thousands and thousands more lives. And let's face it, nobody seems to be interested in that except us. And I want to also bring up this thing that's happening currently with the petal mines. Have you all heard about the petal mines? These are a kind of cluster bomb, and the Ukrainians have been dropping them into Donetsk in the last day or so. They are tiny little things that don't go off when they land. They go off maybe randomly, or maybe if you stand on them. They're like they're called petal mines because they're like the size of a petal. They're like a leaf, and they're everywhere, all over the main streets. So Eva Bartlett's carried this. If you look at her Telegram or her Twitter feed, she's been out there filming them, and some of the awful injuries as a result of them. So I think this is a revolting turn of events. It's horrifying, horrifies me that people should want to hurt other people so badly. But nevertheless, it shows, I think, also a weakness that they are having to do this, that this is their way of trying to win, trying to weaken the other. Jeff, I didn't quite get all your questions, so rather than ask you again now, I'll ask Joe maybe to answer that one. And Jason, Spain, Monaco, well, Morocco is mine dependent, and I would imagine it would like to stay that way. And of course, really, the Straits of Gibraltar, you've got Gibraltar, which is British territory, and they're de facto NATO members because they're British, and Spain and Britain have been arguing verbally over that for decades. So I would very much hope that Monaco would hang on to its independence there, but these times are changing very fast. Who knows? I don't think it's much of a feather in anyone's cap if they do change. Joe, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay. Let me just say also, there's still one person in the attendees list that's not on the screen. I don't know if that person, Cleo, wants to be part of the group here, but if Trudy, if you could do it, and if that person wants to join in, they can. Great. Good to see you there. I'll just try to answer some. I got to the point where we were hearing so much news on Ukraine, and then we started not hearing news on Ukraine, that I got to the point where I started realizing that really what that meant was the Western powers were not doing well, and they didn't want to say very much. However, what does exist, you still hear so much propaganda, because I look very carefully every day. You still hear that the Russians are that the Ukrainians are winning, that they're starting a counteroffensive, that the Russians are worn out, that they lost 70,000 men. They claim to have lost about 7,000. Ukraine also claims that 40,000 civilians have been killed, but the United Nations figure is 4,000 civilians have been killed. And you think about that, in a war like this, that 4,000 killed, you take what you want from the Ukrainians, there's a lot of exaggeration, and the Western news media takes, for Ukrainian sources said, in the first days of the war on Iraq, when we went into Iraq and massively bombed the cities with what we called shock and awe, we killed more than 4,000 in days then. But that hypocrisy is never mentioned, and it's very important to understand that. How do you get out of this? Well, Russians have tried to negotiate several times. First of all, during the war against the independent republics in the Donbass, where 14,000 people were killed, they tried twice, with the help of Germany and France, to make some peace agreement. They were called the Minsk Accords. They had a meeting in Minsk. They had the first one and then the second one. But Ukraine, and I believe at the behest of the United States, but I have no proof of that, never abided by any of the agreements. They continued the war. And so the Russians must look at this and say, okay, well, they signed these agreements, but they didn't abide by them. Should we continue with agreements? Well, in the beginning of this fighting that was going on in Ukraine, they had another peace talk. And the Ukrainian said, well, maybe we can get some accords. Maybe we can get somewhere on this. And as Pippa mentioned, he ended up dead. He was killed, one of the Ukrainian negotiators. They had another accord, which Ukraine said they would accept. It meant giving back Donbass. It meant not saying they would not try for Donbass anymore or Crimea, but it was the accords that were done in Turkey. And a few days later, they went back and said, no, we no longer agree with this. We're taking back all the territory. I believe that was also on the behest of the United States. There's a document that was done by the Rand Corporation, a think tank in the United States. I don't have the exact title in front of me. It was called How to Unbalance and Defeat Russia. And it talks about all these things that are happening now, how to try to defeat them through sanctions and to do these kinds of wars that will deplete their power and so forth. That's what they're trying to do, the United States. It's trying to weaken and defeat Russia. They would like to see Russia come under the control of Washington and Wall Street and use it to further surround China, in my opinion. But it's not going that way for them. And I think that's something to think about. Is there a way out? I think there is. Russia still says it will negotiate. Ukraine says no. Ukraine's making a lot of money. Zelensky's going on the covers of magazines with his wife and doing glamour shots and all this kind of stuff. We're sending them tons and tons of money. A lot of it goes to these oligarchs and people in Ukraine, but most of it comes back to the American arms industry. We give it to them to get arms, and they get the arms, and these arms industries are making a fortune, just like the pharmaceutical industries made a fortune during the COVID crisis. These are things that they want to do. So I don't know where they'll go with that. On the two conferences, it wasn't. See, I consider myself an anti-imperialist. That means, in my mind, I don't like any violence at all, to tell you the truth. own a gun. I've never held a gun. I've never shot a gun. I never wanted to do that. But I believe it's imperialism that causes wars. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, what's going on in Yemen, the various coups throughout Latin America and Africa, the sanctions they put on countries. 42 countries are sanctioned by the United States because they won't buckle down to the United States will on this. So I consider myself an anti-imperialist, but I don't think that people who have a perspective that they are against imperialism and people who have a perspective that they are against violence have to be on opposite sides of the issue. I think we were all together in the war on Iraq when we fought the war in Iraq. We were all together when we fought the war on Afghanistan. I just think that some people in this movement are speaking the narrative of imperialism, speaking the narrative of the United States, that our enemy is Russia, that our enemy is Assad, that our enemy is Gaddafi. And, whatever you think of those people, the United States has no right to intervene and to have a war or try to overthrow them. That's the anti-imperialist position. And I think that's what's important. I think we can work together. And I think the anti-war movement will come back together at some point, because I think the reality of what's going on in Ukraine is going to make itself seen and understood. In terms of Spain, there's a couple of things you should know about Spain. Spain is run by a social democratic party called the Socialist Workers' Party, which before it was in government was opposed to NATO. It had a position against NATO. Now it hosted NATO. So it has changed now that it's in government. There's a group that's slightly more to the left of the Socialist Workers' Party, which some of us might remember, Podemos, it was called. They're in the government with the Socialist Workers' Party. They also had an anti-NATO position. Now they have a pro-NATO position. This is not uncommon. This is not unlike what some of the anti-war groups or peace groups are saying. When the pressure comes down, they fall on the side of the imperialists. And why is that? The more and more as I look at this, when I hear Zelensky say this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia, this is a war of the civilized world, for the whole civilized world. Who is he talking about with the civilized world? He's talking about Europe and the United States that he wants to be part of. This is the white world. This is the colonial powers that were colonial powers that had slaves, that sold slaves, that that were the white supremacists. And there are people who have grown up in these areas that just have this feeling, that we're good people. Sometimes we make mistakes and so forth. The rest of the world isn't agreeing with this and it's becoming very clear. Not on the sanctions against Russia, not one South American country has agreed to those sanctions. Not one African country is going along with those sanctions, and only 3 Asian countries are going along. That is, the global South is not going along with those sanctions. And why? Because there's now another trade alliance that's coming into being. The power is shifting from Washington as the hegemonic power to the East. China's economy is about the same size or bigger than the United States. And with Russia as an ally, with India as becoming an ally, and these other countries, they understand they can get a better deal than what the IMF would give them. The IMF would say, we're going to give you a loan, but you have to pay it back at these usurious rates. And that means a good proportion of your gross domestic product is going to have to go to these Western banks, and you will never be able to become a developed country. You will remain as an underdeveloped country. People are seeing there's a different possibility now. And I think that this war is showing that. This war is the precipice. It's the thing that's changing the world over from, some people call it a unipolar world to a multipolar world. I'm not sure I agree with those terms as much, but I understand that idea and I agree with it. to maintain that balance and not have the US, which has been so aggressive and so militaristic, as the one power in this world, I think is going to be good for everybody in the world. And in the long run, we're going to see a changed world. And that's the only way I think we're ever going to get peace. You know, we're not going to get peace from a country like the United States that has its military in 170 countries and has 20 times the number of foreign military bases. Everybody else has a military budget close to that of the rest of the world. About 50% of our discretionary budget in the United States goes to the military, and it's only rising. So we don't want to. That's not the power that's going to bring peace to the world. We need to see the kinds of shifts that we're starting to see, and Ukraine is starting to show them. So I don't know if I answered any of those questions, but let me see what Kirk has
we got
to
one
say.
more here from Kirk.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kirk.
Thanks for the information, so to speak. My question is it's kind of specific, and if it starts with misinformation, tell me. But it's my understanding that the Israeli foreign minister, who I think we met in the Oliver Stone movies, was on a trip to London, Paris, etc., when he was in fact removed. And he was supposedly at least a Nazi sympathizer, if not a Nazi. And I just wondered if you were aware of that while you were over there, and you know, if it happened then, and if it was interpreted then. Thanks.
Are you muted, Joe?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm saying I'm not sure, but Pippa was saying something about this today. Maybe she has some more information, and John has his hand up. Maybe he has some more information. I don't really know too much about this.
Well, I have a question for Pippa. You're in the UK now, right? And you've got a rail strike going on, I understand. And what is the sentiment in the UK, which has been very aggressive under Johnson in promoting war in Ukraine?
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you, John. Your sound was a little difficult, Kirk. So I think that you were talking about the Israeli foreign minister.
No, the Ukrainian.
Ukrainian.
Okay.
Who I believe was a.
I know the answer to that, I think. But anyway, go on, Pippa.
You get a point. Well, I'll answer John as I'm muted. John, there's a lot of sympathy for these rail workers. They've taken 0% wage last year and the year before, and this year they've been offered the same, 0. The change in working practices is very detrimental, both in terms of hours, night shifts, in terms of pay, in terms of everything. And whilst some people would say it's a bit of an inconvenience, which it is, obviously, I would say that most of Britain is behind them. Certainly, I haven't heard any dissenting voices. So power to the rail workers. They've got a very good leader. His name's just escaped me. He's very coherent. He's
Lynch.
a really good speaker. He's definitely putting the view that you know that this is not just a class struggle, but he's not using those words. He's very, very clever in the way that he's putting this forward, and I think every time he gets interviewed, he gets like another 1 million people supporting the rail workers. There's more than one rail union, by the way. The ones that are on strike yesterday, ASLEB, earlier in the middle of the week, it was the RMF. So there's the strikes sort of happening all the time, but I think it's a tactic, obviously, to not all go out at once, but just in bits and pieces to sort of spread the agony a little bit. But, you know, these guys, they've got the safety of thousands of people in their hands, millions of travellers. You know, they deserve the best. But it will set a precedent, and the government's going to fight it hard. Okay, Joe, over to you.
You know, just a couple of things. First of all, Trudy, there are 2 people, attendees that might be promoted to, if they'd like to come onto the screen and see us. So
All right, one of them turned us down.
Okay, that's all right. They don't
And the
have
other
to,
one,
but they
I
could
go
hear.
ahead and invite here, somebody.
Okay, so anyway, just on the rail strike, first of all, it's not a continuous strike. It's been like they strike for a day and then they do something else and then they go back and then there's another strike and so forth. And there are different rail unions, but when they were on strike the other day, the leader of the union got onto the BBC and they did an interview with him, and he was just incredible. He had he understood every aspect, and he just spoke so well and so beautifully that the whole country must have been totally swayed by it. And everybody they've interviewed, as Pippa says, when they interview people on the streets and they say, "Isn't this an inconvenience for you? You can't ride the train today." And they said, "Oh, they deserve everything they're asking for." So it's very interesting. It's a different consciousness a little bit than is in the United States, but it's not the only union. All the unions are having. See, they announced that the rate of inflation last month, or in the last few days, they announced it is 10% here. So when you ask people not to take any raise, you're asking them to take a 10% wage cut. They said to the federal employees, which includes the health workers, the doctors, the nurses, who have been asked to work like crazy during the pandemic and take no increases during that, to sacrifice people, they offered them 2%, the government. So they would be asked to take another 8% cut. The dock workers are doing the same thing. So the dock workers have now announced a strike. So it will be very interesting to see. And the other thing is, there's a word that they use here in Britain now. It's called energy poverty. It means people who don't have enough money anymore to heat their homes or anything. And what?
I said energy poverty isn't very new. It happens every winter.
Well, it's new. I haven't heard that term before, but in the winter, they're expecting, with these high energy prices that are going up like crazy, that there's a lot of people who are just not going to be able to heat their homes. And a lot of people here have, the way they heat their home is they have a meter in their apartment and they have to feed the meter with money to get the heat to flow. And they're not going to have the money. And they don't have the money. And so there's a lot of people that are suffering under this economic problems here. And the question is, what's going to happen? The unions here are stronger than they are in the United States. And people identify more with the unions. Now, the Labor Party, the leader of the Labor Party is terrible. One of the Labor Party ministers, who's in the House of Commons, went and joined the picket line for the rail workers, and the head of the Labor Party fired him from his position within the Labor Party. He said, "We can't be a party of protest anymore. We must be a party that wins elections." So there's going to be a struggle within the Labor Party, in my opinion, too, and maybe the Coburn faction will come back in. So there's interesting political developments. And I think it's not just going to happen here, it's going to happen all over Europe. And I think it's going to happen in the United States. And I think that will be the basis of organizing and mobilizing progressive people to make the kind of change that's needed. The United States is a country where, as Bernie Sanders told us, 0.1% is wealthier than the bottom 90%. In a place where, people are not getting enough food and not being able to eat, there's going to be, all over the world, there's going to be a lot of protests and problems, and a chance, I believe, for the left to make some big gains and look towards changing the society, one that looks towards people's needs more than profits. So that's just my thought. There was another question that I missed. Kurt's question.
Yeah.
Here's what I heard, Kurt, and maybe it's different than your thing. The minister from Ukraine went to Germany, not to England, and he did give a speech to the German parliament. And now you have to understand that Germany is the country where the Nazis were.
Right.
And they have laws against Nazis in Germany. They teach about what happened during that period in all the schools, and people learn how terrible the Nazis were. They, unlike the United States, where we could have statues of Confederate heroes, Confederate generals, and name roads after them, and people that had slaves, they can't do that in Germany. It is illegal to have a Nazi statue up. They could have it in a museum where they talk about how bad. So this guy comes, who's a member of the right wing in Ukraine, speaks to the German parliament and lectures them that Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator, was not such a bad guy. And there's a good reason why he should be a hero of the country. And and it caused a big row within their parliament. And so you got to think of the contradiction there, that this country, Germany, that was the Nazis, that had been very conscious about being against Nazism, is now supporting Nazis. And one of them came to their parliament and lectured them on that these Nazis in Ukraine aren't so bad. So,
but he had to resign after that.
Yeah, I think he resigned. You should know what's going on in Ukraine. Zelensky's firing all sorts of people. It's clear there's purges going on, and they're having very serious problems. And so, anyway,
We got a couple more questions here, Joe.
Well, I posted to the chat, there was a radio interview of that ambassador, a short one. And then Ukraine dismissed the ambassador. He didn't resign, he was dismissed.
So Janet, was that your question then? That was why you had your hand up. So then I think
Yes.
just John Flanders then.
Yeah, the second part of my question to Pippa was about sentiment about Ukraine in the UK, given Johnson's role as a big promoter of collaboration and support for Ukraine, and he's constantly making trips to Kiev, evidently.
Yes, John. What can I say? We're caught in a web of propaganda. Social media is a bit of an escape, really. We're probably having the same cycle of propaganda as you. It's a sort of cut and paste thing. The sentiments are changing, I would say. The UK took a lot of Ukrainian people in, but there has been a big outcry. You know, you didn't do this with the Syrians, you let them drown in the channel. You know, you're keeping, people from Palestine and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, you're keeping them in prison camps on the border, and people are actually wising up. The Ukrainians have come here with a little bit of a sense of entitlement, which isn't making them, it's not doing them any favors, to be honest. I'm not saying they all are, that would be hugely unfair. But the sentiment, I think, is changing. I mean, in the beginning, you know it as well as I do, those people who are on Facebook, they have Ukrainian flags on their images, on their avatars, and everything was pro-Ukraine, hate Russia, anti-Putin. And then all those little Ukrainian flags dropped off and people started thinking about what they were getting into. And so I'm finding personally, I've been called a commie, I've been called a tanky, I've been called a Putin shill. People who I've known for years and years have blocked me, this is all going on. And it is not nice, but I guess we all have to put up with that. You stick your head up above the parapet and it's going to get, somebody's going to aim at it. So yeah, you duck and dive, that stuff. But I think generally it's changing, and I'm finding more people are unafraid to repost news that's coming from Donbass, to repost footage that people are actually taking in the area. And more people are cluing into alternative news analysis, which I think we all are. I'm gathering from what I've been hearing that some people are probably clued into the Duran and the guys on that, and to Patrick Lancaster and to some of the people for whom they're now going to be sanctioned. I mean, we have Graham Phillips, who was is a UK citizen, has been sanctioned by the UK government for his reportage. They've seized his assets, his bank account, and he's fighting it through legal terms, but he can't raise any money because it will be taken from him. And I think all of us in the anti-war movement have to be a little bit wary that, you know, the net's closing in. I mean, this is a dying monster, but it has a long tail which is lashing out, and it'll hit everyone. So, you know, we've got to learn probably more about solidarity than we've had to learn in many, many years. Just recently, there was the FBI raid on the Uhuru movement in St. Louis, I believe. Now, you know, come on, these guys haven't done anything wrong. They're in touch with some of the people I'm in touch with. So you think, wow, you know, they're getting it. Well, they're black, they're anti-imperialist, they can be tolerated for only so long, and they will try and clamp down on this kind of dissenting voice. So we have to learn to stick together. We have to learn to support each other and not to abandon each other when it gets uncomfortable. I think that's a real lesson we have to learn from what's been happening the last few days. I'm just going back to your previous question, John. The General Secretary of the RMT is Mick Lynch, and he's a really decent speaker and has got his head on the right way around. I think if anyone's going to pull it off, it'll be him.
Just on Boris Johnson, there's a rumor now that there's a rumor now that they're going to make him head of NATO. So I don't know what's gonna go on with that. But I do want to pick up on the last point that Pippa made, because I think it's very serious. There is a group, and the group is actually a member of UNAC, called the African People's Socialist Party. That group is not part of UNAC, but they are the leaders of an anti-war coalition of Black people called the Black is Back Coalition. And there are some leaders of UNAC from the Black Alliance for Peace and Black Agenda Report that are actually also members of the Black is Back Coalition. And the leader of that is a longtime Black radical who has a position on Ukraine that's different than that of the US government, and has been very aggressive in putting it out there. And FBI raided his house, and they threw stun grenades into the house. They handcuffed them, and they might be trying to indict them on something, maybe similar to what went on in Ukraine. So maybe at this time they can't tolerate opposition positions, which has happened in the past in the United States during McCarthyism and during the 1920s, during the Palmer raids, or the Red Scare, they called it. During that period, they basically arrested the leadership and most of the membership of the IWW and some of the leadership of the Socialist Party for opposing World War I. Eugene Debs, who for opposing World War I, was put in prison and had to run on the Socialist Party ticket from prison because he opposed the war. It was an act which is still on the books called the I forget what it is. It's the one they're attacking Julian Assange with.
Patriot?
Not Patriot. The
Espionage.
Espionage Act, still on the books. And although Julian Assange is not a member, is not someone in this country, has never been in this country, for opposing exposing US secrets, they're trying to put him in jail for the rest of his life under the Espionage Act. Espionage, how could he be committing espionage when he's not a member of the United States, not a part of the United States? So anyway, so maybe they're gonna do some more cutting down on the ability for people to speak. If what I said about the changing of relationships in the world which is very serious. Maybe that's what they're talking about, you know. I mean, the dollar is no longer going to be the method of trade around the world. It's being replaced by other means. The SWIFT banking system run by the United States, which allows you to trade by sending money to one country to the next, maybe that's not going to be used. The U.S. has seized the resources and money of so many different countries that countries don't want to go along with it. They're going to use something else. Maybe the United States is in a panic over this, and maybe part of it is to close down dissident voices. And so we'll have to see. Anyway, they did attack this particular Black group. It's easier to attack Black people than it is white people. But it happened before. Other members of UNAC several years ago, 23 of them had their homes raided by the FBI. There was a big defense campaign for them. You could go to Stop FBI Repression on the internet. If you just put that in, you'll see the website and it'll tell you their whole story. It included a member who was on the executive board of UNAC on the administrative committee. They went after them. They wanted to bring them in front of a grand jury and get them to name names of people they worked with in Palestine. And they said, no, they wouldn't. They risked arrest by saying that, but they never followed up with them. But they were attacked. And now they're attacking again. This time, Black people are being attacked. And this guy in Britain has been attacked for, guy in Britain was attacked for going to Donbass and videoing people in the areas that have been taken by the Russians. And they, you know, one after the other said, we're so happy that the Russians came. We consider this liberated territory now. You know, it was under the Ukrainians, it was a terrible situation for us. And they explained what was happening. And so he put that out, and the British government went after him and said he's spreading Russian propaganda. The people from the African People's Socialist Party that were attacked, they were attacked for spreading Russian propaganda. So, you know, what's the story, you know? And as Pippa said, I know some of the same people that they know, and, you know, so who knows what's going on. But we all have to come in support of anybody that's attacked in this way, in my opinion.
Well, we're down to the less than 10 minutes here. I don't see any other questions. Do Pippa and Joe have any final thoughts, or are there any quick questions? Anybody got anything?
Well, I'll just say that, you know, as I said, I think we're in a time of great change, and great change is always a difficult time to go through. It was the Chinese curse of may you not live in interesting times. Well, it is interesting times, but it is difficult. It's going to be difficult. I mean, just in terms of, you know, energy prices and so many existential threats, nuclear war, climate change, pandemics. We went through a pandemic, which we were lucky it wasn't very deadly, but it was very contagious. We've had other pandemics that were very deadly and not very contagious, like AIDS. Both of them come from bringing over from animal diseases, all part of climate change. What if the next one is deadly and contagious? What does it mean? These are existential threats for our very existence. It's not the time to sit back and do nothing. It's the time to join a group like Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace and other groups, and you know, stick your neck out a little bit.
Pippa?
Well, maybe, yeah, I'll just put in a couple of words, and that is for a while anyway, the Ukraine agenda pushed climate change off the menu in terms of news. But we had a really bad heat event here at the beginning of last week. In fact, Joe and I were attempting to travel home during it and we're back to the railroads. They were cancelling trains for fear of buckling tracks and all sorts of things. And we somehow navigated our way by catching 4 trains in different directions to get round the heat dome. But climate change did fall off the agenda. Now, there we have a news program on Channel 4 here, which is a publicly funded channel. It's not terribly popular, but they spent 2 whole evenings talking about climate change. And for yourselves, with the floods in Kentucky, which have killed so far, I think, 25 people, and the fires raging everywhere else, and the consecutive harvest failures are going to follow on. And this is where, you know, the shortage of grain, it meets the Ukraine war, because it's not just the grain being held up at the ports. It's the, you know, that grain isn't going to move in a hurry, by the way, because some of those boats have been damaged. The seamen have all left the boats because no one was feeding them or bringing them water, so they left months ago. The water is mined. Who is going to navigate these boats through the water? I mean, there's, you know, the grain isn't going to move quickly or in a hurry. There's a lot to sort out. But the shortage of grain, compounded by the shortage of fertilizer in the rest of the world, because remember, we're all growing crops time and again on the same piece of land, the same crops. And if you're a gardener, you know that doesn't really work. You've got to rest it, you've got to grow a different crop. But you can overcome this by using specific fertilizers to improve the soil. So fertilizers aren't getting through, your crop yield is going to go down. And if fertilizers continue not to get through, the crop yield will go down beyond a point that is sustainable for the populations that we have. So really what I'm saying here is that everywhere in the world has got fires and floods, everywhere. It's not reported, and it's getting a lot worse. And I was born at, I always say that I was born at 311. I was born at 311 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and I think today it's probably about 380. I haven't looked recently. We're way past the safety barrier. And you know, war is not solving anything, it's making it worse. The pollution is worse, the burning is worse, the poison of the soil is worse. The refugee situation is worse. It just makes everything worse. It compounds the problems we already have. And for the likes of us, you know, the people stuck in the middle, and our children who may or may not be called up to fight some war somewhere over Taiwan or anywhere, we have to really seriously consider taking a stronger anti-war stance for the sake of continuity of just food stuff for the population of the world. So we have to, I think, you know, get stronger, band together, be less afraid of joining the dots between the news cycle, the propaganda cycle, the environmental cycle, the war and peace cycle. We have to join all these dots and get stronger, become more strident in our asks. And yes, we might suffer for it in the short term individually, but I don't think there's an option. So you'll be seeing me stick my head out a lot more often. I think you guys are all wonderful. You've also had great questions, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joe and Pippa. It was just great to hear from you. Back here in the States, we miss you, and we can't wait for you to return. I think Joe said October, so we'll be looking forward to that. One question your person asked if this program is being recorded and if it will be available. I'm assuming Joe will put a link to the recording on the UNAC website, and I'll put it on the Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace website, which is I think John might have put a link to that already in the chat, but it's BethlehemNeighborsForPeace.org. So it's been just great to hear from both of you, and I really appreciate all the people that joined us today and all the great questions. And I guess that's it. Does anyone else have a final word here before we sign off? Okay, thank you all very much. And
Thank you.
Let's do this again.
Yep.
Lots of love to you all.
Thanks.